So good morning. My name is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association. I'd like to welcome the attendees to this morning's webinar on hantavirus awareness. This is the 18th webinar that the Motor Safety Association has released in conjunction with the Western Equipment Dealers Association to provide webinars to the memberships of this group and association. All webinars that we've currently done or provided are less than an hour in length, and some dealerships have been using them for lunchroom information sessions because we upload all webinars to our website as well as YouTube after the webinar. You may have noticed that right now your microphone is muted, and those microphones will remain muted throughout the duration of the presentation. And the reason for that is sometimes there's an opportunity for background noise, and just so we don't take any distractions from the webinar through distraction and feedback. But however, we do have a couple of venues to communicate. There's the question box as well as the chat box, and we took advantage of the question box a little earlier. I had some people communicate back to say that they could hear me okay, so I appreciate that feedback. And anytime that you do have any questions, please enter them in one of those formats, the chat box or question box, and I will look at all those questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll keep flowing along, and then we'll deal with the questions and answers at the end. So on the agenda for today's webinar, we'll discuss an introduction to hantavirus, offer some tips and tricks on preventing and controlling rodents. We will discuss the duties of employers and workers. We'll look at different sources of infection, symptoms, and treatment around hantavirus, and give you some ideas and a bit of a procedure on cleaning and machinery and buildings that comes from the Public Health Agency of Canada. So that's what we've got planned for this morning's webinar. So first off, I'd like to open up and talk a little bit about hantavirus. It is referred to as HPS, Hantavirus Pulmonary Syndrome. And what this is, it is a group of viruses that cause fever, pneumonia, and can eventually lead to death. The hantaviruses are transmitted to humans, whether it be directly or indirectly through contact with either saliva or rodent droppings. Usually we see these coming primarily from deer mice as the main carrier, but field mice and other ground voles or rodents can also be carriers for HPS or hantavirus. At this time, there's no preventative vaccine that you can get to prevent hantavirus. Similar to perhaps a flu shot, you can go in during flu season and receive a flu shot, and that helps prevent the exposure to flu. But with this situation for hantavirus, there is no preventative vaccine available at this time. So just to give you an idea of how serious hantavirus is, this was an article released by the CBC last year, August of 2014, and this is in respect to what happened in Saskatchewan. A second person has died after coming into contact with hantavirus. So there was 4 reported cases last year in Saskatchewan, 2 of which resulted in death. And this topic that we're speaking to today, hantavirus, was suggested to us by a dealer group, which was very near and dear to them, this topic. I know in various health regions in the province there have been cases of hantavirus, and I was trying to do some research to see what I could find as far as any cases for 2015, and I stumbled across one here, a short little story I'm going to open with. And it starts with a 26-year-old Canadian woman from the prairies was admitted to intensive care unit in acute respiratory distress. She was previously a healthy person with no past medical history concerns. Approximately a week prior to admission, she had started to feel unwell with a headache and a fever. One day prior to admission, she began to have a dry cough and an increasing shortness of breath. On careful questioning, the husband had noted the only unusual event that occurred approximately 2 weeks before the onset of symptoms was that she had cleaned out their garage, removing everything and vacuuming. She had commented on the abundance of mouse droppings in the garage. Despite aggressive ventilator support and careful fluid administration, she developed overwhelming pulmonary edema, went into shock, and died 24 hours after admission. Her infection testing confirmed HPS, or hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. So here's an example of a quite healthy 26-year-old who didn't have any past medical conditions, who was just exposed to cleaning the garage and those mouse droppings, and that caused her to eventually pass away from this infection. So we know that it is quite severe. Since Canada has been looking at tracking these records, in 1989 to the present date, actually up until January of 2014, as far as the stats go, there were 100 confirmed hantavirus deaths, or hantavirus cases, which resulted in 27 deaths in Canada. So 20 out of 100 cases, 27 people had died. When we look into Saskatchewan, there was 30 cases since 1994, and 10 of those resulted in death. And out of one of those 10 people was someone that I had actually known from my home community. She moved out of our community into their family, relocated in East Central Saskatchewan. When she was 23 years old, she had fatally was exposed to the hantavirus virus, and she passed away in 1997. So it does affect people right across the province, and the various provinces' memberships of WIDA. This is quite a concern. And we've seen an overall presence in the media communicating this. In the Leader Post, which is a local newspaper in Regina, have passed on information about hantavirus in the April newspaper, just to give people some more communication about it. So far, knock on wood, there hasn't been as very many cases in 2015 that have been documented opposed to last year. So we're hoping that that trend continues downwards. But it is somewhat exclusive to when we're looking at the areas that are affected. We see this primarily in the prairie provinces, or the western half of North America is where the hantavirus rodents are quite active. And there are some distinctions between the different carriers of hantavirus. For example, I talked about deer mice and field mice earlier in the presentation, and with those items, for perhaps the field mice are carriers, but the house mouse is a unicolored gray mouse, which is somewhat different in looking opposed to the deer mouse. The deer mouse, as you can see in this picture, is dark brown with a white belly on it. And that mouse is one that is the main carrier of the hantavirus. So they do have a distinct appearance to them. You can see they do have a bit of a larger ears and larger eyes, but the main primary difference when we are looking at it is the color. As I mentioned, the house mouse is one colored, light gray, and the deer mouse is brown with the white belly. So who is really at risk when it comes to potential people that can receive hantavirus? Well, when we look at farm producers, they have barns, sheds, different buildings, and there's different grains perhaps in these buildings, and mice seem to flock into those sort of environments to take shelter and nest. So it puts farm producers in a high risk group, as well as citizens of rural communities. I know when I went to school in a rural community and lived in that rural community, the community was surrounded by fields. So the crops would be seeded right up to people's backyards as well as around the school. So after harvest, there would be different grains and opportunities for mice to nest and burrow around. So citizens of rural communities were quite exposed, because when it comes to the change of seasons, those mice would be looking for places to nest, so they were on the move. So that group's at risk. And what about you folks at the dealerships? We have salespeople that are accessing machinery, service technicians are repairing machinery, delivery people perhaps are driving the equipment. And even parts, people, they may climb up into a combine to get a part number off of a belt or a sheave. So they're also exposed to the machinery that could have the potential risk group for hantavirus. People buying and handling, selling grain. Janitors or custodians. They're the people on the front line that could be cleaning up these mice droppings. They are at high risk. Or basically campers or people who have unpredictable contact with rodents. So I think this covers off quite well everyone in today's webinar, or people right across the prairie provinces do fall into these risk groups. So what are some things that we can do to prevent and control rodents? Rodents always look for opportunities to eat. So where there's a food source, they're going to build a home. So if you do have grains laying around, I know sometimes dealerships, they open the elevator doors on the combines and they may run them outside of the dealership on a certain spot. Those grain piles can build up, or some grain will leak out from the combines or grain augers into the dealerships, and those are opportunities for mice to feed on. So if we can reduce those food sources, it's going to keep those mice from coming into those dealerships to have their shelters. And they also, when they are looking at those shelters, they're looking at perhaps piles of pallets. So what does our lot look like? Do we have old pallets in knee-high grass that have been there for years? Or do we have old parts machines, old combines and tractors that haven't been moved in many years that are potential shelters or for rodents to live in? What about our nesting materials? Do we save every cardboard box in our receiving department in case we need it and have those opportunities for nesting? Are there blankets, rags, cloths lying around? Those are the sort of things rodents look for. What about our garbage cans? Do we have lids on them? In Saskatchewan, there's actually a regulation that you're to have lids on garbage cans, and that's more so speaking to combustible materials for fire hazards, but it does go a long ways in preventing mice from getting into the garbage cans by having well-fitted lids. And one can also seek the help of a qualified rodent inspector. They can come into your dealership or site and spot those sources of food, potential shelters and nesting materials, and give you some information about how to minimize and prevent rodents from building a home in your dealership. So if there is a severe infestation, at that time, it would likely be a good idea to contact a professional exterminator. These people have the correct equipment, the proper training, and they do this for their occupation. So they know how to deal with rodents and wear the correct personal protective equipment and to handle the process in the safest fashion. So under severe infestations, that would be the best practice to have a professional exterminator. Sometimes we see in dealerships they have a hungry cat that's roaming around, and cats do a long ways as well in controlling rodents within the dealership facilities. And when we do look at opportunities of controlling rodents, using a good old-fashioned spring-loaded trap is way better than using a poison or a rodenticide. Because what happens is if a poison or rodenticide is used, it takes a long time for that deer mouse to perhaps die. Therefore, it roams around freely, further contaminating areas, and then we still don't know where the carcass eventually ends up. So with the spring-loaded trap, we've got them in the trap, and now we know what we have. So, in addition, I just want to add a point about trapping. Don't use live traps. This is something that people, qualified control experts do. So they would use live traps to conduct hantavirus testing. So for the sake of the dealerships, just a standard spring-loaded trap is the best way of controlling those rodents. So what happens when you get a rodent into the trap? I did some research and I came across a website, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and I will provide that website at the end of the webinar. It had a procedure on how to deal with infected rodents and discarding them and removing them from traps. So what the process entails is you would seek a disinfectant solution, either a Javix or a bleach or another over-the-counter similar disinfectant, mix it to a 1 to 10 dilution rate, and you would have that in a spray aerosol bottle. And by using that product, you would be able to spray down the mouse and the trap, and then once you've done that, you would be able to take the gloves and the proper personal protective equipment, and you would take that rodent and you would place it into a plastic bag and twist tie it, and then you would place it into a second plastic bag so that it is double bagged, and that would be the best process, and then you would discard it with your regular garbage. So again, that process is taking that disinfectant solution, spraying down the rodent and the rodent trap, and going through bagging it, twist tying it, placing that into another bag, twist tying that shut, and then discarding it with your regular garbage. And of course, you want to wash your hands and sanitize them after this process has been completed. And I will go into some highlights later on about the correct personal protective equipment to use and itemize those for you. So I'm going to touch on some of the duties of employers. The employers must determine if the worksite is infested with rodents and inform staff. That is the right to know. We have the right, or workers have the right to know about hazards in the workplace. So that would fall under this category. So at that time, if the employer would train the staff to remove rodents or contact the professional extermination services. So they may call on, they may have this done ahead of time, where they decide to train the staff to ensure that they know how to remove rodents safely, or contacting the professional extermination services. It's also required that the employer and safety committee develop a hantavirus exposure control plan if the staff are expected to remove rodents. And again, that's a regulation in the province of Saskatchewan. And it is a regulation among some of the other provinces. And for the sake of the attendees of today's webinar, I came across a very good hantavirus exposure control plan from WorkSafe British Columbia, which I will email to all attendees of today's webinar. But the next few slides, I will give you some ideas of what this hantavirus plan includes. So the plan must address informing workers of the disease risk, transmission, and symptoms. So this could be done through a toolbox talk of informing workers. You can use this very webinar that we're listening to right now to inform workers of the disease and transmission risk. As I mentioned, it will be uploaded to YouTube as well as on our website later this week. The plan must also include infection control procedures, including how to clean up using the correct disinfectant, the PPE usage, and washing, as well as the workers need to be trained on all areas within the exposure control plan, and remember to ensure that training is properly documented. The plan must also include the need to seek medical attention if the worker develops symptoms. So does the plan include calling 911? Or is there a local medical health clinic in your community? So this would all be done upfront in the exposure control plan. The plan would also address documenting of those exposure incidents and investigating them. Because a lot of times when someone's exposed to hantavirus, it takes a week or around a longer time period for that strain, for those symptoms to become active in the person. So it is important to document those exposure incidents, and for the committee or the group designated to conduct an investigation as to why this happened and look at different ways of minimizing that risk. And keep in mind, the plan should be readily available and reviewed every 2 years. So once you have a plan or program, just don't shelf it. So take a look at it every 2 years and revisit or update it as possible. A good thing that's always I like to see within these plans is the safety triangle. And a lot of times the best place to always start is right at the top with eliminating the hazards. And just 1 second, I'm just getting some feedback from one of the attendees here. I just have to go in and mute them. Just 1 second, everybody. Okay. Just 1 second. I just have some feedback coming in from one of the attendees here. Okay, is that hopefully that resolves that situation. Sorry about that. And we'll progress, and as I mentioned before, around the safety triangle of eliminating the hazards. That's the place to start, right at the top. So if we can eliminate those hazards and minimize the potential, is the best source, opposed to just starting with personal protective equipment, because we do have many opportunities above that we can look at addressing ahead of time. So the employers, as well as the workers, do have some responsibilities. The workers, their duty is to attend training sessions provided by the employer. Also to follow safe work practices. And another resource that will be given to the attendees of today's webinar is we will be forwarding them a safe work practice that was on our website regarding hantavirus. So that will be something that will be emailed to all of the attendees as well today, is that safe work practice. The duty of the worker is to also use the correct personal protective equipment for rodent cleanup and to report those exposure incidents. So when they do occur, they should have them reported. As I mentioned, it takes time for the symptoms to become active. So knowing about those symptoms and having them reported will help with the treatment down the road. As well as a very important point on this final point of the slide is workers should know that they should not clean up contaminated rodent areas without the proper training and PPE. We think about that person I was talking about in the very early slides, that young mother of two who passed away from cleaning their garage by vacuuming and sweeping up those the rodent damages and the droppings from the mice. That eventually led to her death, unfortunately. So that's why it's very important knowing not to clean up these contaminated areas without the proper training and PPE. So how exactly do these sources of infection get into our to affect humans? Well, through either the rodent saliva, their urine, their droppings, or the materials contaminated with them. And for me, that was a big one. It's easy to spot rodent droppings, but materials contaminated by rodents is a lot harder to spot. So if we see the evidence that there's rodent droppings in an area and there's various nesting materials that have built up, those could very well be contaminated by rodents and be a source of infection. So keep that in mind. Also, hantavirus survives for 2 to 3 days at normal temperatures. And as there's more sunlight and more heat, those numbers actually cut in half. So we'd see about 1 to 2 days of the hantavirus living with warm temperatures or increased sunlight. But the opposite is true for freezing temperatures. So as temperatures get colder, that hantavirus survival time doubles from 4 to 6 days. So look at the scenario. If a customer brings in a combine to your dealership in October after harvest, and it could be potentially infected with the hantavirus strain for additional 4 to 6 days, depending on the temperatures. So keep those situations in mind. It's not just pertinent to a certain season that you're only going to get it in summer. We're looking at spring, we're looking at fall, we're looking at winter and summer. So it's right across the board. And so when we look at ways that this is transmitted to humans, through our respiratory system, we're inhaling those contaminated or airborne particles. And that's what's getting into our system. Or we could have direct contact with skin or eyes, is also causing that to affect us and give us that hantavirus infection. or if we were to eat or drink contaminated food or water. I don't even want to think how that can happen, but that is a source of infection. Or being bitten by an infected rodent will also be sure to give you that source of infection. One thing that was quite neat I want to also mention, I talked earlier about having predators such as cats, and at this time there's no evidence that hantavirus can be spread through insects, cats, dogs, ticks, or even infected people from person to person. So it is through these various sources of inhalation that we're infected, but it can't be spread through other insects or species or human to human, which I found quite interesting. So just to kind of give you a visual, so we have the infected rodent droppings that become airborne and brought into our inhalation, into our respiratory system, into our lungs. And this causes some muscle aches and fevers and coughs, and eventually leads into respiratory distress, which could lead to death. So to kind of give you another visual of what these symptoms look like, so the early symptoms start out with fatigue, fever, muscle aches. And when we talk muscle aches, it's large muscle masses like your back, your shoulders, your hips and thighs, those muscle groups, just severe aches and pains, dizziness, chills, abdominal problems, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and those are the early symptoms. But what's startling to me, and maybe to yourself as well, is these symptoms are very similar to the flu or food poisoning. So I think there's actually a lot more cases of HPS or hantavirus pulmonary syndrome that do go undiagnosed because they don't progress to those late symptoms. So I think those numbers that from the stats are, in fact, the ones that have got to the late symptoms when people have seek medical attention, then they've done testing and determined it was hantavirus. So I think a lot more people are infected than what the actual stats indicate. So to talk about the late symptoms, they're usually present about 4 to 10 days after the initial contact of that virus. So this could happen, like I mentioned, sometime after the fact. So we're looking a week and a half after from the initial infection that these symptoms are occurring. So these are the coughing, shortness of breath, and from one of the people who'd survived hantavirus, in their exact words, quote them saying it was a tight band around their chest and a pillow over their face, unquote, was their exact words of how this felt to try to breathe as they were fighting for air, because their lungs fill with fluid, and that's what eventually causes people to fail due to this virus. So it is important, obviously, when we are experiencing those symptoms, to seek medical attention immediately. So if you have a fever or respiratory infection, so this could happen within 6 weeks of that potential exposure. So it is critical to have that information and keep it those exposure possibilities documented. I think awareness goes a long way. Even as I developed this webinar, I learned quite a bit about hantavirus. I knew it was serious, but just realizing how it affects everybody and the potential sources and how it gets into people's respiratory systems and the length of time I found quite scary. We're looking at 6 weeks. We're still having these symptoms and potential exposure, and it sits in people various time frames. So again, it's important to inform the physician of that potential exposure you had so that they can give you the best treatment options. So once we're looking at cleaning machinery in buildings, if we see evidence of mice or rodents, for example, this wiring harness, you can see that the outer coating has been gnawed off and some of the inner wires are showing. So if we see signs like that, or if we see a nest that's packed into an engine compartment like on the other diagram, or rodent droppings, stains, sometimes you can hear them, rodents burrowing around. But usually the one that sticks out are like some of those obvious visuals, but the droppings, the mice droppings, they have 50 to 60 droppings per day that look like a black pellet. And if we see those and some of these other signs, it'll be quite evident that there are signs of rodents in that facility. So what do we do? How do we combat this, or how do we clean this mess up? Again, I went to the Public Health Agency of Canada's website, and the procedure that they had given for suggested personal protective equipment is to wear splash-proof goggles, rubber disposable gloves, disposable puncture-proof coveralls, rubber boots or boot covers, and a mask. And so that's the suggested personal protective equipment. As I mentioned, if there are severe infestations, contacting a professional exterminator would be the best practice. But if you have been trained on it and informed of the hazard and have the correct personal protective equipment and an exposure control plan in place, you may proceed forward if it's called upon you, of course, if you receive the right training and personal protective equipment. But when we're done with the personal protective equipment, it should be decontaminated and discarded. So some of the items you can reuse would be the rubber boots, splash-proof goggles. That stuff can be just soaked and disinfected and dried and reused. But disposable gloves and masks are disposable for a reason. And I mentioned before about wearing the proper mask. The guideline is an N100 mask. But there are other ones you can wear. There's an N100, an R100, or a P100. All three of those masks filter out 99.97% of airborne particles. The only difference is the N100 is not resistant to oil, the R100 is somewhat resistant to oil, and the P100 is strongly resistant to oil. So but just keep in mind, people that have beards or facial hair will have trouble getting a good seal on their mask with the respirator. So just to make sure that's taken into consideration, if people have respirators, like on the right-hand side, that they are properly fit tested and that the elastics are tight with these disposable ones, because you don't want to be sucking product or material between your cheek and the respirator into your respiratory system. And again, as mentioned, the respirators on the left are disposable. Do not reuse them. And there are good practices as well for storing the respirators on the right in sealed plastic bags when they're not in use. So some companies or suppliers actually offer hantavirus kits. And if you have your staff are trained and you have the exposure control plan in place, and they may be called on to clean up the odd case of mice droppings in the dealership, this could be a potential kit. Of course, it's missing the boots and the coveralls, but this is just an over-the-counter kit, which includes dust masks, the rubber gloves, the goggles, the disinfectant, and has a quick guide to hantavirus. So, of course, kits, you can make your own kit up as well, but this is just a guideline. It's something that people can purchase as well for preventing hantavirus. So if we are called on cleaning machinery and buildings, and within a dealership, if we do get a combine in or a grain auger, and there are mouse droppings and mice nests into it, again, this is a guideline for cleaning it. So what you would do, for example, if we're in a combine situation, perhaps in the thrashing or separation area, and we'd want to use the wet method where we take that disinfectant spray, we spray that area down. If there's dead rodents, or remember the contaminated areas could be their nesting materials, we spray that stuff down, and then we would scoop the dead rodents or those contaminated areas into plastic bag, twist tie it, and double bag it and discard it. Again, it's a very similar process as taking the dead rodent out of the trap as it is with dealing with the products, say perhaps within the internal thrashing element areas of a combine or inside of a grain auger perhaps. But things get a little more trickier once we're working in the cab of a piece of equipment. Sometimes mice like to nest in the blower motor areas or behind some of the paneling and the wiring harnesses. And using the wet method may cause some problems with the computer module, circuit breakers, relays, fuses, electrical components. So using the wet method may be a challenge in some of those areas, but you definitely want to avoid disturbing the scene as far as taking your air blowgun and just blowing it out of the cab. Because remember, these products now become airborne and inhaled into your respiratory system. So anytime you disturb those, it is going to cause you some grief. So it is the best practice wherever you can to spray it down with the wet method, the area, and the contaminated area, and discard it in plastic bags. But inside the cab, as I mentioned, you can't sometimes do that. So I did come across a procedure which mentions it's okay to do this using a shop vacuum if you have the required personal protective equipment and you're using a high efficient HEPA filters on the vacuum. So once you've done that, you vacuumed out the infected area, you're not just going to open up your shop vac and dump it into your trash can. At that time, you take the cover off your shop vac, you would soak the contents with the disinfectant solution, and then bag it, twist tie it, and double bag it. So that is the correct procedure if you're dealing with the cab of a piece of equipment or various areas within a combine or in a facility, or taking the mice out of a trap and discarding it. So again, we're soaking it when we can with the disinfectant, double bagging it, and always remembering to wear our PPE when we're doing this task. So that hopefully gives some different ideas around different ways that we can minimize that exposure or risk to hantavirus, and different ways that we can deal with it before it becomes airborne and we get it into our airway, causing us a lot of concerns and eventually symptoms which could lead to death. The hantavirus itself, on average, has a 30% mortality rate of the reported cases. So it is, as I don't have to mention further, very severe and with tragic outcomes. So I do want to leave you folks with some resources. For each province, they have either a Ministry of Labor Relations and Workplace Safety, or a division of OH&S, or Occupational Health and Safety, or a division of the Workers' Compensation Board. And some of these groups have very good resources for hantavirus and for inquiries. I'll also be sending to the attendees of today's webinar, Saskatchewan has a very good book on hantavirus guidelines. So in addition to the safe work practice, the exposure control plan, you'll also be getting a copy of the Saskatchewan guidelines for hantavirus awareness. So I'll be sending that to the webinar registrants post-webinar as well. So those groups are very helpful for workplace situations. If you do arise to a situation that you have inquiries at home or on the farm, each province or jurisdiction would have a public health inspector who could help them out to provide information. So utilize those people as well. Take the information that we've got today. It's going to help you whether you're at work or at home. And as promised, I did borrow a lot of information from the Public Health Agency of Canada for their procedures and guidelines around hantavirus. So their website is below. So it would be www.phac, that stands for Public Health Agency of Canada, -aspc.gc.ca. And that's a very good resource, and they're always updating it and adding things to it. So I encourage you to lean on those resources for further follow-up down the road if you have some more concerns around hantavirus. That brings us to the tail end of our webinar today, and I'm just going to mention too, I'll also be sending a webinar certificate that people can fill in with their name that they've participated in today's webinar. Some dealerships may have more than one person sitting at a computer workstation, so if there are more than one workers at the workstation, they can definitely fill in the certificate template as well, even if they weren't registered individually. You will also receive a short evaluation survey after the webinar, so please feel free to fill that out, give us some feedback. It helps us give you guys the best possible product. And something new that's coming from the Motor Safety Association is we're going to be offering online courses. Our first one will be on driving defensively, so stay tuned, that'll be coming out in the near future. And we are always welcomed to future topics. As mentioned earlier, this topic of hantavirus awareness came from a dealer group in the province, and we are always looking for those hot topics or different things that we can speak to of concerns within your dealership. So please contact me if you do have those topics that you want us to compile a webinar on. It's a very educational information that we pass on, and we find that those topics that come right from you folks work out quite well. So again, if you do have those questions down the road or want to contact us, our phone number is listed on this slide, as well as our website and email address. I'll ask you to save the date for November 18th, 2015 for the next webinar that we'll be releasing. And at that time, this concludes our webinar. I'm going to stay on the line here for some time. I see right now there are no questions or chats that have came forward, but I will stay on the line here for a while before I disconnect if any other questions do come to mind. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time this morning to learn about hantavirus awareness in agricultural dealerships. So I didn't receive a question, but I did receive a compliment, a thank you. So no, we appreciate the thank you, and I'd like to thank you folks for making these webinars a success. We had over 51 people registered, and you know, by having you folks come out and take the time, it means a lot to us that you trust in us to spend that time with us to receive that information. So thank you for those words of thanks. We appreciate it just as much.